09:28 a.m., December 13th, 1943. Northeast India, over the Brahmaputra Valley. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair has 90 seconds to decide whether his home base lives or dies. His Curtiss P-40 and Warhawk, Lulu Bell, is clawing up through thin morning haze, Allison engine howling at full combat power. The airframe shudders as he pulls into another climbing turn, trying to bleed the speed just enough to get into position without overshooting his target. 3 miles off his left wing, a dark smear in the sky resolves into separate shapes. Not a raid, a wave. 24 Mitsubishi Kai-21. Sally bombers in tight Vs, glinting in the high sun, trailed and covered on all sides by a buzzing cloud of some 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters. 60-plus enemy aircraft. 1 P-40. Below him, the airstrip at Dinjan lies quiet and vulnerable in the river plain, its pierced steel planking shimmering faintly. 14 C-47 transports are lined up like fat silver fish, bellies loaded with fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies bound over the Hump to China. Beside the runway, a row of low hospital tents shades 63 wounded soldiers who were supposed to be safely behind the lines now. Fuel bladders, drums of avgas, and stacks of crated freight sit in exposed pyramids. Adair doesn't have to imagine what a bomber strike will do to all that. He's seen the photographs. In the last 8 weeks, Japanese raids on Assam airfields have destroyed 47 transports and killed over 100 men just in this theater. At other strips, similar formations have achieved 90% hit rates on undefended targets. If they reach Dinjan intact, this base becomes another smoking line item in someone's report. His fuel gauge reads full internal tanks, roughly 180 gallons, 90 minutes at combat power if he flew smart. The Japanese bombers, down at about 10,000 feet, are trudging along at bows. 240 Mababiaumar, noses pointed directly for Dinjan. The Oscars above and behind them sit in stacked layers, some weaving, some riding shotgun. Standard doctrine says what you do next is obvious. If you are outnumbered more than 5-1, you call for help and shadow the raid. Don't get heroic, don't get dead. Adair glances at the clock, does the mental math on distance to the nearest friendly squadron. Jorhat, the 80th Fighter Group's main base, is over 100 miles away. The nearest friends with guns and wings are at least 38 minutes out. These bombers will be over Dinjan in 3. He keys his radio, calls the warning anyway, because procedure is procedure, and somebody needs to know what's coming. Engine control, this is Lulu Bell 4-4, bogey count 6-4 plus, repeat 6-4 plus. 24 heavies, 40-ish Oscars. Heading 270, Angels 10. ETA target 3 minutes. Static hisses back, then a terse reply. Copy 4-4. Scramble order sent to Jorhat. Hold observation. Do not engage alone. He looks down. The transports are fat and utterly motionless. The Hump lifeline stacked on their wings. The hospital tents a slash of white. The fuel stockpiles a giant matchbook. He can do what the radio says. Circle, watch, live. He can land, maybe, and take cover in a slit trench while the Sallies glide over and turn the runway into a funeral pyre. Or he can do something that every line of the training manual says is stupid. He can attack 64 aircraft by himself and hope to make them miss. Adair feels his hand move almost before his mind catches up. He shoves the throttle forward. The Allison V-1710 in Lulu Bell's nose roars, manifold pressure climbing past 50 inches. The Warhawk surges, speed building. He pulls her around, nose slipping north of the bombers, climbing until he's 4,000 feet above the head of the formation. He slides out to the sunward side, putting that unwelcome star at his back. Below, the Japanese go about their work, confident. Fighter pilots expect opposition over the target, not 20 miles out. They're looking forward, not up and behind. They haven't seen him yet. 1 P-40, 650 cal Brownings, 12 seconds of total trigger time. 64 enemy aircraft. It is an insane equation. It is also the only one Dinjan airfield has. Dinjan airfield wasn't much to look at on a map. Just another strip carved out of scrub and rice paddies in Assam, stuck between the Brahmaputra River and the Himalayan wall. But in December 1943, it was a vital node in a fragile supply line. From Dinjan and other similar fields, C-47s and C-46s launched every day into some of the worst flying in the world, over the Hump, that stretch of the eastern Himalayas where winds could flip a loaded transport over like a toy. They carried fuel, ammo, radios, spare parts, even live pigs and chickens to keep Chinese troops fed and fighting. Chiang Kai-shek's armies, ragged but still in the field, depended on that trickle. The Japanese knew that if they could cut enough of those airstrips in Assam, the Hump would choke. So they started raiding them. Radar coverage in the region was thin. Early warning depended on spotty reports from ground observers, scratchy transmissions from other airfields, and blind luck. In the previous 2 months, raids like the one now bearing down on Dinjan had hit other bases hard. In Burma, similar-sized formations had wiped out parked aircraft in neat lines, fuel stores, and maintenance hangars with appalling efficiency. The math was ugly. Each lost C-47 wasn't just a plane. It was hundreds of tons of supplies over months of flying. Each destroyed drum of avgas meant fewer sorties. Ground crews had started sleeping in tents away from the flight line, not from regulation, but from bruised wisdom. It was safer under a tree than next to an objective. Into this environment flew the 89th Fighter Squadron, part of the 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, tasked with keeping Japanese raiders off the Hump fields. Their primary tool, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. By late 43, out over the Solomons and New Guinea, the P-40 was already considered yesterday's fighter, heavy, not as glamorous as a Mustang or as agile as a Spitfire. But in India, it was what they had, and in the right hands, it was more than enough airplane. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was one of those hands. 23 years old, 40-plus combat sorties under his belt. He'd spent the last months flying cover for transports and making intercepts when radar or chance allowed. Most days were long, hot, and boring. Some ended with burning wreckage in a field somewhere and a small circle of men staring at it quietly. He'd already seen what Oscars could do to unwary Allied fighters. Reports from Burma told of P-40s and Hurricanes shredded in turning fights they should never have accepted. Allied doctrine against Ki-43s was simple and had been hammered into him from training onward. Do not turn with an Oscar. Use speed, dive attacks, and vertical maneuvers. Hit once, then extend away and reset. The P-40N variant he flew was faster than an Oscar in a straight line, its Allison V1710 engine giving it almost 380 mph at low altitude, and those 6 wing-mounted 50s hit like a truck. But it was heavy. It bled speed fast in hard turns. If he got slow and tried to circle, an Oscar could simply carve inside him and stay there until he died. That doctrine assumed he had somewhere to extend to, friendlies, or at least room to drag the fight away. Looking down now at Dinjan, there was nowhere to drag this fight. If he flew away and waited, the airfield died. If he dove in, he risked being swallowed by a cloud of fighters and chewed apart. On paper, that was an impossible choice. In the real sky, with the bombers already inbound, it wasn't really a choice at all. From 4,000 feet above and slightly behind, the bomber stream looked almost neat. 2 V-shaped elements of 6 Ki-21 bombers each at the front, another pair behind them, all lined up on the mental chalk line that ended at Dinjan's runway. Above and around them, the Oscars rode shotgun, some in loose 4-ship groups, some weaving. Adair's advantage was simple and fleeting. They didn't know he was there. He nudged Lulu Bell slightly south of the formation, keeping the sun behind his right shoulder. If the Japanese looked back, they'd be squinting into glare. He rolled the P-40 gently inverted, nose pointed down at the trailing edge of the lead bomber group's port side. Gravity joined with the Allison, and the airspeed needle swept up. 300, 320, 360. Wind noise climbed to a shriek. The Warhawk's frame vibrated but held. Control surfaces stiffened. He forced himself not to fixate on the Oscar cover. If he shot at fighters now, he'd save no one on the ground. The bombers were the point of the spear. Blunt them, and the whole strike dulled. He waited a fraction longer than was comfortable, riding that knifing dive, until the bombers filled more of his windscreen than felt sane. The Ki-21s held their course, snug in formation, each crew trusting the man in front to guide them in. They expected interceptors to appear near the target, not dropping out of the sun 20 miles east. At about 800 yards, close in fighter terms, closer than training instructors liked, Adair lined his sight on the left-hand bomber in the lead V and squeezed the trigger. 6 Browning M2s in the wings chattered in unison, the whole aircraft shuddering as 50-caliber slugs poured out. Bright green tracers leapt from Lulu Bell's wings, little beads of fire curving toward the bomber's left wing and engine. He walked the stream up from wingtip toward the nacelle. Fabric ripped, metal panels sparked, then the left engine cowling of the Ki-21 erupted, orange fire licking backward as the prop tore itself to shrapnel. Flame and thick black smoke unrolled from the port wing like a banner. The bomber lurched sideways, its crew suddenly yanked out of routine and into survival mode. That shock punched straight into the brain of every pilot in that V-tight formation. Flying depends on trust, that the man next to you will fly a predictable path. The instant that trust died in fire, the V fell apart. Bombers swung left and right. Some climbed, some dropped. The clean spear point of the attack smeared into a loose, ugly cluster. Adair blew through the formation, the P-40 screaming past the bombers' tails at nearly 400 miles an hour, close enough that he briefly saw the whites of a dorsal gunner's eyes behind his canopy. Tracers stitched the air around him as surprise gunners threw rounds at the streak of American fighter that had just amputated their leader. He didn't try to dally for a second kill pass. He yanked back on the stick, pulling Lulu Bell into a high-G zoom climb out of their fire arcs. 7 Gs pressed him into the seat, vision dimming at the edges. The P-40 groaned in protest. As he crested the top of his zoom, rolling right to look back, he finally saw the angry bees coming his way. Oscars. Dozens of them. 40 nimble little fighters were turning in toward the threat, like dogs to a whistle. The nearest 4 came in from his 10 o'clock high, line abreast, their radial engines roaring, guns ready. He had maybe 2 seconds to make his next mistake, or his next miracle. Doctrine whispered in his ear, "Don't turn, extend, dive away, live to hit again." He looked down. The bombers he'd just scattered were already trying to reassemble, swinging back toward their bombing track. Every second he spent dancing with Oscars was another second they had to tighten up. He couldn't just run. He had to fight to miss, not just to kill. The Ki-43 Oscar was the kind of airplane that made Allied pilots swear out loud. Light, agile, paper-thin, it wasn't much for taking hits, but it could carve circles in the sky nothing American-built could match. Its butterfly flaps let Japanese pilots snap into tight turns without stalling, bleeding speed by choice, not by mistake. Adair had read the briefings that said Oscars had downed 60-plus Allied fighters in the last half-year over Burma and Assam alone. Now he was looking at the closest 4 through his windscreen. They came at him in a loose finger-4 formation, the lead slightly ahead and above, wingmen trailing on both sides, a 4th hanging back as cover. He rolled Lulu Bell left into them, nose lifting just enough to bring his guns to bear, and squeezed off a 2-second burst. Tracers arced out, but his sight picture was off. The lead Oscar jinked right, the burst going high. His thumb came off the trigger. He couldn't afford to hose bullets around like that. 12 seconds of total ammo meant maybe 5 or 6 meaningful attacks, if he was disciplined. 1 pass spent, 5 or 6 left, bombers regrouping behind the curtain of fighters. The Oscars made their own passes. 2 dive from above and behind, guns flashing. Adair caught them with the corner of his eye and yanked Lulu Bell into a climbing left turn, using what extra horsepower he had at this altitude to convert speed to vertical separation. A few rounds stitched past his tail and upper fuselage. One tore a neat hole in his right aileron skin. No controls locked, no fluids sprayed. He was lucky. He reversed hard at the top of the climb, dropping the nose, aiming himself back down between the paths of the diving Oscars, forcing them to overshoot. Everything in him wanted to pick a fighter, glue his sight to it, and keep shooting until it broke. Everything he knew told him that was suicide against this many. Down below, the bomber stream told its own story. What had been one tight spear of death was now 3 ragged clumps of sallies, each trying to find the others, glancing around nervously, crews shaken. Some had jettisoned bombs early when he hit their leader, a reflex drilled into many bomber pilots. If you think you're under lethal attack, drop weight, regain flexibility. He needed more of that panic. He dove again, but not at an Oscar. He picked the nearest bomber element that looked like it was trying to reform a clean V. He aimed not for a wing root or cockpit this time, but for the air between them. As he flashed across their noses, guns silent, he rocketed through the space where a disciplined bomber crew expects safety and predictability. Gunners flinched. Pilots wrenched yokes in instinctive, evasive moves. The formation shivered, then broke again. Oscars followed him, frustrated, diving in spirals, firing when they could, rarely with good angles. He wasn't trying to win a dogfight now. He was trying to be a mosquito in the worst possible place at the worst possible time for the Japanese, the seconds before bomb release. He used the P-40's relative speed like a stiletto, slashing in and out, alternating his target between bombers and the gaps where bombers wanted to be. Every time an Oscar closed too much, he dove out into the vertical, extended just far enough to break contact, then hammered back in from a fresh angle. It was frantic, ugly flying, not the clean boom and zoom of a textbook. His ammo counter ticked down, 900 rounds, then 700, 500. Each burst was a calculated bleeding of seconds. He tagged one Oscar glancingly, saw a smoke trail from its cowl as it rolled away. Another pass raked a bomber's starboard wing, forcing it to pull out of formation smoking. Behind the whirling mess, Dinjan's runway slid closer and closer to the bomber element still moving west. If they ever got 3 clean Vs back together, someone on the ground was going to have a very bad day. Adair glanced at the altimeter, at his position relative to the field, at his ammo count. Then he made the decision that would later leave other pilots and ground staff literally speechless when they heard it. He stopped trying to pick them off one by one. He decided to make 64 men believe they were badly outnumbered when there was only one of him. Most men in aerial combat think in terms of guns and geometry. Philip Adair, in that moment, started thinking in terms of psychology. He'd already learned one thing about this bomber group. They were drilled to respect fighters. The second he lit up their lead sally, the formation had fractured. When he flashed through their noses without firing, they'd flinched. They were expecting opposition. What if he could convince them the opposition was far bigger than it actually was? He looked at the sky. Sun behind him in the east. Thin, broken cloud patches at 12 and 15,000 feet. Haze layers obscuring the ground in places. He had altitude. He had speed. He had 6 guns and a dwindling crate of ammunition. He also had a radio the Japanese could overhear, whether they intended to or not. He clicked the transmit switch twice, not on the tower frequency, but on the interflight channel his squadron used out of habit. Banshee lead to all elements. Tally 60-plus bogies inbound on Dinjan, he said loud and crisp, knowing full well he was the only one there. Blue flight, take high cover. Red flight, hit the lead bombers. Green, cut off their egress. It was theater. There was no blue or red or green flight in the air that morning. But any Japanese radio man who happened to be monitoring Allied frequencies would hear those words and draw his own picture. At the same time, Adair altered his attack pattern. Up until now, he'd been coming in from roughly the same quadrant. Now, he started bouncing the formation from different points on the compass every 30 seconds, never long enough in any one vector for anyone to be sure whether it was the same P-40 or another. One dive from 7 o'clock high on the port side of one bomber element, guns blazing in a short, violent burst that chewed up a wing and sent fuel spraying. Climb hard, disappear into a cloud scud. 30 seconds later, another screaming pass from 2 o'clock high over a different group's nose, tracers walking between their Vs but not hitting anything, just enough to make them break. Oscars chased him doggedly, but every time they thought they had him lined up for a turn fight, he dumped his nose and let Lulu Bell's weight carry him out of their plane of motion, then spiraled back in from yet another angle. To a bomber crew craning their necks around, it must have looked like there were fighters everywhere. One dorsal gunner, in a Ki-21 that later limped home, would reportedly tell his interrogators after the war that he'd seen at least 5 or 6 P-40s slashing through the formation that day. There was only one. Down on the ground at Dinjan, men started pouring out of operations huts and tents, shading their eyes. What they saw was even stranger from below. Single specks of sunlight flashing as a fighter dived, streams of tracer arcing, bombers shearing off course, then another speck from an entirely different direction, then another. It looked like a squadron. Inside Lulu Bell, Adair's world shrank to a few vital numbers. Airspeed, position over the bombers relative to the field, ammunition counter, 400 rounds, 300, 200. Each pass became more about where he was than what he hit. He aimed his dives to cross directly ahead of bomber elements as they approached their imaginary initial point, the spot where they'd normally start their bomb run. Every time he did, bomb aimers flinched from their sights, pilots wrenched controls to avoid potential collision, formations broke, and the carefully planned run dissolved into scattered tracks. In at least 2 cases, bomber pilots, unnerved by the constant harassment and apparent multiplicity of attackers, punched their bomb release early, dropping sticks over empty jungle and river rather than over Dinjan's metallic grid. On one especially tight pass, Adair cut so close across the nose of a Ki-21 at high closure that his wingtip vortices knocked the bomber into mild turbulence. Its pilot, convinced they'd narrowly avoided a collision or ramming attempt, dumped ordnance in panic. From the ground, observers saw multiple strings of explosions walking harmlessly across fields and riverbanks short of the runway. The Oscars, furious, kept trying to trap him into a corner of the sky. He refused to owe them that corner. He never turned more than 90 degrees without a dive or a climb to change planes. He never stayed in their gun sights longer than a heartbeat. Once, he faked low fuel, leveled out as if to extend away, luring a half-dozen fighters into pursuit, then yanked into a climbing roll back over and behind them, creating, for a precious 10 seconds, a clean lane for another head-on pass at a bomber group. His last burst of the day was short and desperate. 1 second tap into the engine cowling of a Sally that was stubbornly holding course. The left engine coughed smoke. The bomber slewed just enough to throw off its bomb run. Then his guns went dry. No more illusion of teeth. But the illusion of numbers was already working. What had begun as a disciplined, layered strike of 64 aircraft was now a ragged mob. Bomber groups were scattered over miles of sky. Some had already dropped their bombs in the wrong place. Others broke off entirely, climbing away toward Burma, crews unwilling to fly straight and level through what seemed like a hornet's nest of fighters. By the time the first rosy tone of Jorhat's inbound P-40s reached the edge of the battle space, the sky over Dinjan was a mess of retreating dots and fading smoke plumes. No bomber ever made a clean, steady bomb run over the airfield. From the operations shack, when the all-clear finally came, the CO stepped outside, looked at an almost untouched runway, and had to ask the question everyone was thinking: how many did we get up there? The duty sergeant, who'd been on the radio the whole time, answered quietly. 1, sir. In the minutes after the last Japanese aircraft disappeared back into the haze, Dinjan Airfield held its breath. Men waited for secondary reports, delayed explosions, fires starting in unseen fuel dumps, casualty calls crackling over field telephones. They didn't come. Instead, there were scattered columns of smoke outside the perimeter, in paddy fields and along the Brahmaputra's muddy banks, where bombs had cratered uselessly. The C-47s sat untouched, shimmering in the heat, Ground crews ran hands over fuselages as if expecting to find holes anyway. The hospital tents, with their rows of wounded, flap doors still tied open for air, stood exactly as they had an hour before. Fuel dumps remained heavy, drums stacked, bladders full. The only real physical damage at Dinjan itself came from a few stray .30 caliber rounds that had claimed a couple of holes in a revetment wall and scared a motor pool sergeant into spilling his coffee. As the adrenaline ebbed, realization hit in ripples. In the control tower, one controller stared at the plotting board, then at his colleague. "They dumped early," he said slowly. "They dumped most of it short." Later that day, reconnaissance aircraft photographed a whole string of fresh bomb craters neatly spaced along the riverbank east of the field and gouging up rice paddies. Plane captains and doctors and clerks who'd heard the initial contact report, 64 enemy, 1 friendly, had quietly started making mental lists of who they'd be helping dig out of rubble. Instead, they watched Lulu Bell come in on final approach, battered but flying. Adair's landing was no air show. Bullet holes freckled the wings and fuselage. One panel of the right aileron looked like someone had taken a can opener to it. There were fuel stains along the right side where a round had nicked a line before self-sealing tanks did their job. As he rolled out and taxied past the flight line, ground crews broke into spontaneous cheers that he could hear dimly through the canopy. He shut down, popped the canopy, and sat there for a second longer than strictly necessary, staring at his shaking hands. 20 minutes later, in the debrief hut, the intelligence officer had his map out and a slightly stunned expression. "Walk me through it again," he said. "You made how many passes?" Adair shrugged, still feeling the ringing in his ears. "I stopped counting after 5, he said. "I wasn't trying to bag Oscars. Just keep their heads down and their formations messed up. I don't think I shot any bombers down outright after that first one. Maybe damaged a couple." The intel officer tapped his pencil on the map. "You kept 60-plus aircraft from making an effective run," he said, "with one airplane. That's, not in the book." Elsewhere, communications picked up fragments of Japanese chatter later that week. One intercepted message from a unit debrief mentioned repeated unexpected fighter opposition over Dinjan and multiple P-40s disrupting bombing accuracy. The confusion in that plural made pilots and analysts on the Allied side grin. Back at Jorhat, when the 89th Fighter Squadron returned from their scrambled sortie too late to join the fight, they found their squadron mate back on the ground, peeling off his parachute harness. "You crazy Idaho son of a—" one of them started, clapping him on the back, half anger, half relief. "Anybody else was going to do something?" Adair shot back lightly. Then he sobered. "I just didn't want to watch it burn," he added quietly. Awards and citations would come later. Letters home, if he ever wrote about that day at all, would probably downplay it. What stuck in the minds of those who were there wasn't just that one P-40 had faced 64 aircraft. It was that the bombs didn't hit what they were supposed to hit. And that changed the tone of every subsequent warning over Assam. From then on, when somebody called in "one friendly airborne," the men on the ground didn't automatically assume they were spectators to their own execution. Sometimes one really was enough. In the official histories, the great names of air combat in World War II are usually attached to big numbers. Aces with 20 victories, squadrons with dazzling tallies, battles where hundreds of planes clashed. The day Philip Adair took Lulu Bell up alone against 64 Japanese aircraft over Dinjan didn't produce a string of confirmed kills you could print on a recruiting poster. He likely shot down one bomber for sure, and may have scored damage on a few fighters and other bombers. His real impact, the thing that left people speechless in the debriefs and quiet for a long time on the tarmac, wasn't measured in silhouettes painted under his canopy. It was measured in the numbers 0. 0 C-47s destroyed. 0 fuel dumps turned into pillars of flame. 0 hospital tents reduced to scraps. 0 bombs on target. That was new. His own comrades had expected the math of that day to be different. Fighter pilots deal in odds all the time, and 64 to 1 is a figure that makes even the bravest men swallow hard. The Japanese air staff had their own expectations. Based on previous raids, they had every reason to believe that a formation of that size would cripple an undefended airfield. Neither side got what it expected. Adair's solution wasn't mystical. He didn't suddenly discover that the P-40 could outturn Oscars. He didn't become superhuman. He didn't shoot down half the formation. What he did was recognize, in real time, that there were more ways to win, or at least not lose, than simply chalking up kills. He weaponized confusion. He aimed his first shot where it mattered most, the lead of the bomber formation. He spread fear and distrust inside the bombers by making their crews watch one of their own burn. He kept the illusion of a larger defending force alive by varying his attack vectors and using radio calls the enemy could overhear. He refused to let the bombers ever feel like they were on a peaceful, steady glide path to the target. The lesson resonated beyond Assam. In later tactical debriefs and training notes, instructors would point to days like Dinjan and emphasize that a fighter's job in defending a field wasn't always to shoot down every bomber. Sometimes it was to make sure the bombs that got dropped didn't land where they were meant to. In a sky already crowded with legends from Europe and the Pacific Islands, tales from the forgotten theater of the China-Burma-India front didn't always get star billing. But in letters home and hangar stories, the men who'd been there kept those smaller, stranger victories alive. Years after the war, a visitor walking through a small museum in the American West might find a faded photograph, a young man in a flight jacket standing beside a P-40 with Lulu Bell painted on the nose, the Assam hills behind him. The caption might just read, Lieutenant Philip Adair, 89th Fighter Squadron, 80th Fighter Group, Assam, India, 1943. No mention of 64-1 odds. No mention of the day Japanese bomb craters lined a riverbank instead of a runway because one man decided that sitting it out wasn't an option. That's why stories like this are worth pulling out of unit histories and yellowing reports. They remind us that impossible is often just a description of a situation before someone tries the thing the book doesn't recommend. That sometimes the biggest change you can make in a battle is in the other side's confidence, not their body count. And that even in a war dominated by mass production, massed formations, massive operations, the decision of one pilot in one cockpit, looking down at the field that fed and healed his friends, could tilt the scales. If that kind of thing matters to you, if you think the guys in forgotten corners of the map deserve as much spotlight as famous battleships and aces, stick around. Hit like so this one doesn't disappear into the algorithm jungle. Subscribe if you want the next no way that actually happened story from the war to find you, instead of getting lost in someone's attic. And if someone in your family ever flew or fixed birds over the Hump or sweated on a strip in Assam, drop their names below. They'd probably shrug if they heard us call them heroes. But days like the one over Dinjan don't happen without men like them.